COVID on Friday morning. And so I'm minimizing my meeting anybody in person until I get an all clear, which I still testing positive today. So thank you so much. This is a great and important topic, and I'm really happy to be able to talk to you about it. We're going to handle this chat. I know we had great, input and discussion when we're in person, but because of some of the feedback issues, it'd be great if you have a question or a comment or anything that you want to share, if you could drop that in the chat. And just alert me if somebody sees something in the chat that I don't see for some reason. If you could just let me know, and we will make sure to address it so that we can keep this as conversational as possible. So we're going to talk about changing our relationship with anxiety. And as you can imagine, I have a little anxiety today, having to make this change for you all. And so anxiety is something that each of us experiences differently. And we've talked about this in the last two sessions together, and that we can both, several of us can be in the same situation. Some of us may feel anxious, some of us might feel excited, some are bored. Everybody is a little bit different. And so our reaction to situations and outside stimuli is different for each of us. I'm hearing a lot of background noise again. I'm not really sure who it might be coming from.
Can you please mute yourself?
So we're going to start with the technical clinical definition of anxiety. And just because we have some anxiety or we feel anxious at some point doesn't mean that we have a clinical problem, but there is a way to think about anxiety from a clinical perspective. So this particular definition is from the American Psychological Association. And I'm just going to read it briefly. Anxiety is an emotion characterized by feelings of tension, worried thoughts, and physical changes like increased blood pressure. People with anxiety disorders usually have recurring intrusive thoughts or concerns. They may avoid certain situations out of worry. They may also have physical symptoms such as sweating, trembling, dizziness, or a rapid heartbeat. So that's the clinical definition, but all of us as human beings have anxiety at some time or another. And oftentimes anxiety isn't really a problem for us. It is a result of something that we need to take care of, something we might need to address. And so if you are preparing a dinner, say you're preparing a family dinner or a dinner party, you may feel anxious at different moments during the process of preparation. You may be worried about how the food's going to turn out, how conversations are going to go, whether people will enjoy themselves. So those senses of anxiety are normal, and it's part of our daily experience. Whenever we want things to go well, we may feel a little bit of anxiety. So anxiety can be a good motivator for us to put a little more planning into something, to work a little harder, to be thoughtful about something that we're doing. So anxiety has a really important part in the evolution of human behavior. So we don't want to clinicalize or make a problem of all experience of anxiety, but we're going to talk about it today when it is more intrusive and when it is more disruptive to our lives. And so we're going to move on from the clinical definition and start to talk about some of the things that can cause anxiety. There are physical reasons why we may feel anxious or have a sense of anxiety. And some of those things can be lack of sleep, too much caffeine. You might be on a new medication that can actually make you feel anxious. You could be in an environment that makes you feel uncomfortable and anxious. So these are just a list of them, but the top three, the top five, are the five first ones. So the number one source of anxiety that is not specific to a particular instance, but is pervasive and disruptive to people's lives, is often caused by trauma. So in the wake of 9/11, for a lot of adults who were adults during 9/11, and even children who were in the middle school or in high school who were cognizant of what was happening, the rates of anxiety skyrocketed. And unfortunately, they didn't really come down tremendously in the year to 20 years now, 21 years since 9/11. The instance of anxiety has been on the rise and increase. And so traumatic experiences like, a national tragedy like 9/11, or the pandemic that we're just coming through, or even having COVID actually makes you anxious. So trauma, disaster, so things that are happening in Ukraine right now, the Ukrainian people, the disasters that they have, their rates of anxiety, people who come through hurricanes and tornadoes and floods and fires, all tend to have increased reactions to anxiety. So that we talk in terms of trigger, we're going to get to that in a minute, but things that normally wouldn't bother a person can all of a sudden now cause them to be anxious. There's also a genetic component, and genetic is it's a newer area of research around anxiety. And there's two ways to think about that. There's a genetic predisposition that can run in families to make you more anxious in general to situations. And there are personality types that are more predisposed to being anxious. So people who are hyper attentive to detail, people who are type A, people who have a great deal of empathy, which is a great trait. I mean, all of these are just traits that we have as human beings, but they can predispose you to feel more anxiety than the average person in situations. Also, illness of any kind. Now, you can have transient related anxiety related to an illness, usually based on the fact that you don't know what is going to happen, right? That illness, how is it going to affect you? How does it impact your life on a day-to-day basis? Whether it's a temporary thing, like having a bad bout of COVID, or if you have cancer or heart disease or chronic condition like diabetes. All of these conditions can actually increase our threshold for being anxious. Great amounts of stress. So that's why college students in particular, during exam time, almost always present with more anxiety. End of the year, if you're an accountant, I'm sorry, end of the year, if you have end of year books to do, tax season for accountants, all of that tends to be really situational and added stress that can make you more anxious. But things like just having lack of sleep can make you anxious. Medication, either a medication you may be newly taking or that something has changed for you recently. Medications can actually make us anxious. Vitamin deficiencies, and we're going to talk about 3 in particular that all will increase your rates of anxiety. Finances. And people know that, right? So if something's happening with money, an unexpected expense comes up, there's an illness in the family, loss of a job, cut in hours, things like that. All of those things can make us anxious. A messy space can make us anxious. And one of the things that is recommended for people who have a general anxiety disorder is to do their best to keep an organized space. An organized space and having an organized, comfortable space around you is very comforting and soothing and can mitigate some level of anxiety. Conflict, whether within the family or in a work situation, all of that can raise our anxiety level. So a lot of these things we can say, yes, that makes sense. I understand that. Work environments can be very stressful and cause anxiety. If you feel a lack of control in your life, so if something happens and you realize that you don't really have any control over that situation, that can make us really anxious. Because if we do have some level of control, there's something that we can do to change the situation. And when we feel ourselves to be helpless and have that lack of control, then we actually can present with much more anxiety. So drugs, not necessarily pharmaceuticals, but other kinds of drugs, in particular, marijuana is known to create anxiety. Some people think that it soothes it. The research does not bear that out. Research is pretty strong that things like cigarettes and alcohol and some recreational drugs, in particular marijuana, actually increase anxiety. Poor diet. Some personalities, as we mentioned, are more predisposed to being anxious. Social gatherings make a lot of people anxious, depending on the size of the gathering. Some people like smaller groups, some people like larger groups, and just depending on how your disposition and how you feel about those situations can make you more anxious. Caffeine and energy drinks in particular for teenagers and young adults is very impactful to anxiety and for everybody in general, but in particular that age group is very susceptible to increased anxiety due to caffeine and energy drinks. Also, a high amount of processed foods, because of the chemicals that are in it, can really trigger anxiety for some people. And it seems so far removed from some of the other things that we're talking about, but processed foods and the chemicals that are in it really can be disruptive to our hormones, and hormone disruption, which is the last one, that imbalance is can be anxiety provoking. We talked about that a little bit when we talked about menopause. And that's true here too, especially around thyroid conditions. So if you have too high or too low thyroid function, you can actually have anxiety. Information overload. So if you've ever been to an environment where there's lots of people and lots of music and lots of things happening, some people can get really overloaded, and that barrage of information can really make us anxious. Not taking good care of ourselves or neglecting ourselves. So all the things that we talked about, not getting a good night's sleep, maybe drinking too much caffeinated beverages, having processed foods, not getting physical activity, all of those things can then raise our anxiety level, as does nicotine. So some people, when they're feeling anxious, who have a cigarette habit, will smoke a cigarette and they'll feel soothed for the moment. But on the whole, every time you smoke a cigarette, it increases the level of nicotine in the body, and increased levels of nicotine are associated with anxiety. So it may soothe you in the moment, but later it presents a greater problem. And then, as we mentioned earlier, that hormone imbalance is really important. There are other things, but these are the major contributors to anxiety. So if you struggle with an anxiety reaction that is intrusive and difficult and impactful in your life, it's important to look at these causes and do your best to change your lifestyle and your habits and your environment to try to manage the exposure to these things. Any questions come up in the chat or any thoughts on this so far? Any of this surprising to anyone? Okay, I'm going to keep going. So here are some personality traits that increase your likelihood of being anxious. And I don't want to think of these as either good or bad. They're just things that we do. And we might do some of these at some point in our life and not do them later. We might do them under certain conditions and not others. But people who overthink, so people who are actually really quite creative and have a lot of, building of almost movies in their brain with a lot of detail, people who really think, not overthinking, but thinking in great detail, often have increased anxiety because we creatively think of all the things that we should worry about. And I say that as an overthinker. So levels of perfectionism, if we're always worried about having things done just the right way, presenting ourselves in just the right way, making sure that we do our work and are present for our families in just the right way, having the perfect holiday, the perfect gift, all of that raises our level of anxiety. And so perfectionism is one of the more one of the things that is really helpfully addressed at some of the therapies that we're going to talk about, as well as overthinking. So if you're uncomfortable with change in general, you tend to be more anxious. And that's because anxiety isn't about being in this present moment. It's about thinking about what could happen, what may happen, what should happen, what might happen. And so it's projecting thoughts on situations. I mean, we can, someone who is a really creative thinker and really concerned about making things just the right way, but doesn't really like change, really puts a lot of pressure on themselves in many, many situations. And so thinking about what it is that we are tending toward in our own personality can help us identify how we are impacting our reaction to situations. This is a really interesting one, and that is empathy. And empathy is such an important human trait. I mean, we want people to be empathetic. We want to be empathetic. We want our children to be empathetic, to be able to understand other people's position and needs and things like that. But it also tends to make us more anxious because we're concerned not just about ourselves in situations and things that are happening, but we're concerned about other people in those situations. And so we tend to take on more stress and a bigger load, and that important trait of empathy can also create difficulties for ourselves. So it's not to get rid of empathy, it's to help someone who is empathetic to have the right perspective on what is happening. Introversion, so people who are generally introverted, so they live in their head, they get their energy from being alone, they also tend to be more anxious. If you are easily irritable, so if you're someone that you need to be careful about your sleep and your eating because it can really set you off in some way, you might be more anxious as well. And just like the overthinking, that extreme imagination. So a lot of really creative artists and musicians and dancers and playwrights and authors all tend to have a little bit more anxiety than the average population. So like I said, these are not good or bad. They're traits that we have. And then learning to identify some of these aspects of our own personality can help us to be better at navigating our own response, our own emotions, our own anxiety in situations. So any thoughts on that? Any comments? Okay, so we're going to talk about the different forms of anxiety. So we talked about it at the beginning. Everybody, the human experience, there are things that make us all anxious at some point or another. And some people are more prone to it than others. But these are the ones that we think about from a clinical perspective. Anxiety that impacts our daily life or impacts our life in a way that's very disruptive. So people who have a generalized anxiety disorder are those that are easily move into anxiety in lots of different situations. They're always that sense of discomfort and maybe a little fear about the unknown, and that generalized sense tends to make anxiety a bigger part and more impactful on their daily life. Social anxiety are those who, when they're by themselves and in with their most intimate family members, they don't really experience anxiety, but put them in a social situation or certain kinds of social situations, and they may then have an anxious reaction or even move into fear or panic. And then there's the panic disorder. And this is quite common, and it's related often to phobias. So if you have a fear of, say, snakes or spiders, and you see one or someone is close to you, you are more likely to move from anxiety into fear, into panic, based on that phobia being a trigger for you of anxiety. People who have obsessive compulsive disorder. So that is an overt attention to certain daily habits. So if you have obsessive compulsive disorder, you may need to check that your door is locked 50 times every night in some sort of ritual. Or you may have it related to hand washing. There are lots of different ways that obsessive compulsive disorder can express itself. It could be around food, it could be around clothing, it could be around travel. There's lots of different ways for it to be expressed. But it does tend to make you more attentive and more anxious in different situations. And that makes a lot of sense based on the underlying issues that might be affecting someone. So just like we said, trauma is one of the causes of heightened anxiety. Post-traumatic stress disorder, or PTSD, tends to bring on a lot of anxiety for people in all sorts of different situations. So people who have lived through a war, people who have been the victims of violence, they all tend to have really overt and high low levels of stress that can trigger anxiety. And separation anxiety disorder, we hear about that often with children, and that, a lot of children go through that and they'll move through that. But when it becomes a recurring theme and children don't grow out of it, it's something that does need attention. So these are some of the clinical forms of how anxiety can be impactful in the day-to-day life. Any thoughts on that? It helps to have a little clarity, I think, around this, thinking about it from a clinical perspective. So what can we do to help anxiety? We can do so many things. And I want to just, if you struggle with anxiety, you have a spouse, a loved one, a child who struggles with anxiety, I want to tell you that there is so many different ways to address it. And people who struggle with anxiety can really get to a great place today. There are just amazing things that can be done. And I struggled after 9/11. I was actually on my way to catch a flight on that day, and I had two small children, 2 and 5, and I really struggled and was anxious. I didn't want to fly again. I didn't want to fly ever again, honestly. And that was my kind of reaction to 9/11. And so I ended up having to go to therapy and really work on, because my job required I fly every week. And I did get back up in the air the first day that the planes were back in the air, but I really struggled, and I had a lot of anxiety and some panic attacks on planes. But then I found a really great therapist, and they just told me that of all the things that counseling and therapy can do today, it can address anxiety better than anything else. But these are the things that we can do for ourselves. Just like if we look at those things that can trigger anxiety, these are the things that actually make a huge difference in lowering our overall threshold to anxiety every day. So sleep is number one, making sure that you get sleep. And it doesn't necessarily need to be 8 or 9 hours a night, but it needs to be sleep that's impactful and important for you. So that's anywhere from 6 to 9 hours. And some of us actually need a little bit more than that on occasion. But good quality, uninterrupted sleep is crucial. Exercise, and I mean really intense physical exercise. So some aerobics, lifting weights, all of those things, but exercise, walking at a really fast pace, that really can help with anxiety. And as a matter of fact, movement outside, if you're having an anxious moment, getting up and going for a brisk walk outdoors is one of the number one ways to calm your anxiety. Having order in your surroundings and in your home and in your office and in your bedroom and in your workspace and in your life in general, having order is really, really helpful at smoothing anxiety. Having a routine for going to bed, a routine for waking up in the morning, a weekday routine, a weekend routine. Routine is really, really helpful at calming anxiety because it takes some of the unknowns out of your life and gives us a sense of rhythm that we can connect with. Having a really healthy diet. So fruits, vegetables, healthy fats, you know, making sure that you're eating the rainbow of lots of fruits and vegetables, cooked or raw, it doesn't matter, really can make a huge difference because we're bringing more vitamins and minerals into our body, which is really helpful at kind of providing us with an extra level of strength to our daily routine. Just being dehydrated will make you anxious. So if you've ever been outside or you've been in an activity, and the number one reason why this happens is because when we are dehydrated, our heart tends to beat faster because the blood is a little more sluggish in the body as we dehydrate. And so the heart starts pumping blood even more so that it is able to move the blood around more efficiently. And that rapid heartbeat will, for a lot of people, automatically trigger anxiety. So make sure that you stay hydrated, very important. Athletes and people out on a hike on a particularly warm day can feel that sense of dread and anxiety. And that is really just our body telling us something. It's telling us that we need some water. Meditation is really helpful. It's not helpful in the midst of an anxiety attack or a panic attack or when you're feeling the most anxious. It's something that you do and it calms our entire nervous system and makes us less likely to move into a state of anxiety or an anxious state. Here's 3 vitamins that if you struggle with anxiety, you might want to get these checked by your doc, and you might want to add these as supplements. And in general, I'm a big believer in trying to get all of our nutrition from our diet. But I think with these 3 things and the anxiety, that it's really helpful to supplement. So the first one is vitamin B12. It's almost always the first things that doctors check when you are talking about having an anxiety disorder. We don't get enough B12 in general unless you eat a lot of meat and a lot of greens. Most of us don't eat enough to do that. And so having a B12, now if you're vegetarian or vegan, there are plant-based B12s that come from ocean-based plants and algae that is really effective. So you don't, you can choose something that really works for you. The other is vitamin D, and I think I mentioned this when we were talking last week. And that vitamin D is one of those things that the body does not manufacture on its own. It needs a catalyst. And so in this case, vitamin D, the catalyst is normally sunlight. And during the colder months, like we're in now, even though where I am, there's some sunshine right now, in general, we have low rates of vitamin D in our system. So taking a supplement is helpful. It's only helpful within a 24-hour cycle. So you're going to need to take that on a regular basis. But almost everybody in Northeastern Ohio is low in vitamin D. It's a pretty bold generalized statement, but I'm using it based on some of the research done at university hospitals and the Cleveland Clinic. And the third is magnesium. And magnesium is important for so many different aspects of our immunity, our joints. It helps with muscles. It helps with sleep. It's just a really important mineral, and our soils are depleted of magnesium, and so there's not enough uptake into the fruits and vegetables for us to ingest it and get the right amount of magnesium that we need. So B12, vitamin D, and magnesium are all 3 really important things to have checked and then to supplement. Nature and therapy are two really robust ways to address anxiety. And children who are dealing with trauma and are dealing with the fallout of trauma and have a lot of anxiety, when they're allowed to spend more time outside and even take some of their classes outdoors and be in sunlight and be in nature, their anxiety levels go almost down to normal just by being outside. And so the research is pretty strong that nature and sunlight in particular, that fresh air, the sunlight, all of the great chemical exchanges that we make with the plants and the environment around us is crucial. Therapy and we're going to talk a little bit about some of the therapies that are really effective. And for me, when I was dealing with anxiety after 9/11, I did cognitive behavioral therapy and exposure therapy, and both of those things together made a huge difference. And so now I can fly, and I've been able to fly for 15 years without any difficulty from anxiety. So therapy is hugely beneficial. And your health plan and your EAP, they're a good place to start so that you can start addressing this, because anxiety can take some of the joy out of your life. And this is reassurance that you don't need to live that way, that there are things that you can do and therapies that you can benefit from that can really change your relationship forever with anxiety. And then the last thing, and this is something that most people who do have anxiety around certain things, is to avoid the things that trigger the anxiety to begin with. So for me, I wanted to avoid flying. I just didn't want to fly. I thought I'll just have to get another job and I won't fly, and there are plenty of people who never get on a plane, but that wasn't good for me in the long run. And it wasn't good for my family. It certainly wasn't good for my finances. So I made a different decision, but some people will avoid triggers forever. So if you are afraid of heights and that's a phobia, that is something that bothers you and it can make you anxious in closed spaces, lots of different things, but, avoiding those things that create anxiety for you. The other thing to do is to avoid, if you avoid the trigger, is knowing what is causing it. So you may think that it's heights, or you may think that it's social situations, but really it's much more about some of the other things that you're not doing. You're drinking too much caffeine, you're drinking too much alcohol, you're not eating a healthy diet, you're not getting enough physical activity to burn off that excess energy. And so trigger avoidance can be avoiding those things that cause anxiety, but it can also be eliminating some of those behaviors and things that contribute to your falling into anxiety. Any thoughts on that? Anything in the chat? Okay, we'll keep going. So these are amazing therapies. The number one therapy for anxiety is cognitive behavioral therapy. And it is it's a process that you go through with the therapist to understand how your brain works and what your reactions are in certain situations, and then becoming really aware of changing how you react to certain things. It takes time, but for me, I really only did it for, I think, 8 weeks, and that was what I needed. And that changed my dynamic. And it not only helped with my concerns about flying, but it lowered my anxiety level in general, because it made me very aware and also equipped me with tools to help me understand how my brain was functioning in those situations that was different from other people. Exposure therapy is often something's done, especially for fear of flying, when people want to fly, or fear of dogs, or something that that you need to get over in order to be able to move on with your life. Exposure therapy is a safe way to incrementally allow yourself into those situations where normally you would be triggered, but with a safeguard around you, right? So you dip your toe, you feel a little anxious, you identify what's happening with your body, and you move back into a safe space again. And each time you do it a little bit more. Acceptance and commitment is a form of cognitive behavioral therapy. So is DBT. They're all, sort of processes that you go through with this therapist. You can also read up on them, and there's some really great over-the-counter general publication information, especially about CBT. I think that's really effective. CBT is really effective for quitting smoking. It's often used for people who have other forms of like people who shop too much or people who have a gambling addiction often use cognitive behavioral therapy as well. The interesting one is the EMDR, which this is still early, but it has been shown for people who have trauma-based anxiety to use EMDR. And it's actually physical sensation training to help people not be so fearful and be so physically triggered under certain situations. But it's an interesting and up and coming therapeutic. It's not really popular here in the Midwest. It's very popular on the East and the West Coast. And it's been used in Europe for about the last 25 years, especially for trauma-based anxiety. And then the last one is interpersonal therapy, and that's very similar to talk therapy. So what is anxiety telling us? And I think this is one of the things for me that was the most interesting when I think about anxiety, is that anxiety is a natural human response in certain situations. So if you are in a situation and there are deadly spiders and deadly snakes, seeing one and being anxious about it is a healthy response to the situation, right? It's going to keep us away from that creature, alert to that potential danger, and keep us away from, and in a safe space. Also, anxiety, if you are in a social situation and you meet someone and that person makes you feel anxious, there's something that makes you uncomfortable and maybe even a little fearful, that's sometimes your gut telling you. And maybe there's something about that person that you need to be aware of, that you need to protect yourself in those situations. So sometimes anxiety is giving us really important information. Sometimes we're anxious because, like we said, you're dehydrated and your body is trying to get you to do something to calm that anxiety. So drinking some water, getting out of the sun, eating some healthier food, moving your body, thinking about what anxiety is telling us is, I think, really helpful. And now, if you're in the midst of a panic attack or a really anxious moment, it's really hard to do. But the more we try to get to this place of what is anxiety telling me in this moment, the more likely we are to switch how this affects our life and whether it's impactful long term. So I want to talk about what to avoid again, because this is crucial. There are still going to be situations where you may feel anxious. And so doing things and avoiding those things that can make a difference or make it worse are important. So number one is caffeine. And that's true for caffeine and energy drinks, because there's a lot of caffeination and some other chemicals or substances that actually act like caffeine. So they create that rapid heartbeat, a little more respiration level. All of that can then cause us to feel more anxious. Processed foods. I put the s'more in here, which lots of people love s'mores, but it's a highly processed food, right? Those graham crackers, that marshmallow, maybe the chocolate's okay for you. They all have a lot of chemicals in them. And we might think of it as soothing, but if we're prone to, or we easily move into an anxious state, we need to be aware that processed foods can really impact that. Again, energy drinks, alcohol is a huge trigger, and some people will self-medicate their anxiety with alcohol, but overall, you're not learning to deal with the anxiety or understand how you can change your relationship with things that make you anxious. You're actually just smoothing over a situation in the moment that in the long run, just like marijuana, alcohol really does tend to make us more anxious. It can actually make the situation so much worse. And so it's important to think about that and make sure that if you are dealing with anxiety or someone you love is dealing with anxiety, that you encourage them to eliminate some of these things from their life. Tobacco also, again, in the moment when somebody smokes a cigarette, they may feel relaxed, but increased nicotine in the blood, in addition to being terrible for your heart and your circulation and everything else, it's not good. It will actually raise your anxiety level, as well as marijuana and other drugs also make a difference. So any thoughts so far? We are just like talking about so many different ways to do this. Any comments in the... So triggers are one of those things that, like we talked about earlier, there can be triggers that you avoid, but sometimes just recognizing what it is that's making you anxious is really powerful and empowering, is to understand what it is. And for me, in the post 9/11 world, the anxiety was my fear of leaving my small children without a mother. That was the source of all of my anxiety, because I wasn't due to be on any of the planes that were involved in 9/11, but I was supposed to be on a plane. And so that just brought up this whole level of anxiety as a young mom, as someone who was, really running at both ends, taking care of kids, taking care of a career. And so for me, understanding that that was the source of my trigger was the start of moving into a different place where I felt more empowered, right? I felt I had great tools at my disposal to try to deal with the anxiety in the moment. And then I did all sorts of preparatory things. And it was also changed how I parented, in that I wanted my kids to be super capable. I wanted them to be competent and not be afraid of the world. And so my dealing with my own triggers became one of the ways that I helped actually move through my anxiety and become a better parent, I think, in the end. So understanding your triggers and knowing, or even paying attention to your children and what might be triggering them, or a loved one or a family member or a coworker, is understanding that relationship between what is happening outside of you and how it causes you to move into this state of anxiety that's impactful in really negative ways. Oh, I see something come up in chat. That is my problem. I find it difficult to recognize what are my anxiety triggers. I'm taking it all in stride and moving through it the best way I know how. And that's what we're all doing. And I know that's so, so hard. But if you work with someone, if you work with a therapist, I highly recommend it, because I think that's one of the ways that we can that other person allows us to find a safe space to pull the things away from our eyes, to see what's actually happening and what is our reaction, what is the reality of the situation. And that's why I think therapy is so helpful. And almost all of my friends, and anxiety is a big issue in my generation in particular, that have gone to therapy and really stayed dedicated to it, have all moved past their anxiety state. And as we get older, we tend to be less anxious in general, because we have all of these coping skills. We have a lot of experience that we can meet a challenge, we can move on, life gets better. The unknown tends to not rock us the way that it does when we're younger. But that's not true for everybody. Some people actually become more anxious as they get older. So in general, though, we tend to have more life experience, and that life experience and the fact that we meet challenges and we move on can be very helpful at dealing with anxiety in general. So helping ourselves, we're going to round back to things that we've talked about in the last 2 weeks too, but talk to your provider. So the first thing is talk to your healthcare provider about your anxiety, so that they can help you rule out any of those physical things, right? Like the vitamin deficiencies or any hormone imbalances. Those are really important things to address. So talking to your healthcare provider first. And then find yourself a therapist. Don't let anxiety dim your light. Don't let it steal your joy. Don't let it limit your life. Everyone can overcome their anxiety. And there's many, many different paths to finding it. And some of us take longer than others. there is hope and there is happiness and there is relief on the other side of it. I promise you. Make sleep a priority, because when we're exhausted, everything is more difficult to deal with. Eat healthy, manage your stress, make sure you're getting your vitamins, move your body, get outside, create routine for yourself, hydrate, and avoid those triggers, those negative things that impact your life. So I want to stop here. We still have a good 10 minutes or so. And I want to just have a conversation and let's talk about this a little bit more. You know, we're in a safe space to do this. And
This is Meg. I wanted to say that I had terrible anxiety in my 20s, and actually probably since I was a child. Routine was huge for me, overcoming it, and moreover was finding a cognitive behavioral therapist, which I didn't even know what that was or that did. But it was a real eye opener, and I did a lot of desensitization, learning how to breathe differently. Paying attention to my thoughts was a big deal. It was huge, and I did overcome it. It wasn't easy at all, but I highly recommend it. And I would say, if you don't click with a therapist, a lot of people, because I had therapists after that helped me with it. If they say they're cognitive behavioral therapists and you're not clicking, go find someone else. Makes a big difference. But anyway, that's my personal story.
Thanks, Meg. Thanks. And, you know, it does make us emotional, right? Because we know what a hold anxiety had on our life and how hard we had to work to break that hold. But there's so much, you know, happiness that you can have. You can break free of that hold of anxiety. It is possible. And it's not possible. I mean, it's not even just possible anymore. It's probable, because the things that I went through after 9/11 and what they do now are completely different. There's so much more effectiveness and quicker and ways to move through the process a lot quicker too. So thank you, Meg, for being so vulnerable there. Anybody else? You can just unmute yourself too if you want to. I just want you to see that there are some resources for you to learn more about anxiety in general. I put the direct resources for the Cleveland Clinic and UH because they're local and they're, you know, really, really authoritative, high quality individuals. Organizations, and the information is really robust as well. Here's my information so that after we finish today, if you decide you want to talk privately, I'm happy to talk to you separately offline and then make sure you get whatever additional resources or connections that you need to make. You know, in general, anxiety is not something to be ashamed of, and that more and more people in our society are impacted by it, whether they're really young or they're older. It doesn't make any difference. There's more things provoking anxiety. There's more, it feels like more conflict in the world, even though I lived through the Cold War era as a child. There seems to be more conflict now. And so the unknown and the worry over that tends to move toward anxiety for a lot of us, but there are ways to cope with it. And there are ways to cope with it effectively and not have it run your life or impact your life. So I'm going to stop sharing my screen and just see if anybody else wants to make a comment or share anything. Holiday time is a very anxious time for a lot of people too. for all the reasons that we talked about, right? It might be your personality that's impacting it. It could be, being in social situations, feeling discomfort. Well, I've enjoyed these 3 weeks together. It's been amazing. I'm sorry that I wasn't able to be there with you in person today. Hopefully we'll get a chance to meet again in the coming year. And I hope that you take really good care of yourself and that you and your family and whatever holidays you celebrate brings you joy and peace in this last couple weeks of the year, and that 2023 is a beautiful, bright year for everyone.
Thanks, Melissa. We really appreciate your expertise, and hopefully we'll have you back next year.
Thank you so much for all you have done for us.
Thank you. Thanks for being here and participating.
Okay, we're going to sign off now.
Thanks, everybody.